G'day, so in today's video, I want to show you how to permanently loosen tight chest muscles. If you've been a fan of the channel, you'll know that I'm working my way through a series of videos that hopes to show you how to permanently solve particular muscle groups that become tight for most people. And in today's video, I want to turn my focus to chest muscles because there's an interesting twist that I think a lot of people are missing, meaning all the chest muscle stretching that you might be doing, while beneficial in its own right, may ultimately not be getting you any closer to not having to keep stretching those muscles long term. Just working on muscular stretches alone generally isn't enough to get to the cause of why those muscles have been asked to be tight in the first place. And as we've spoken about the psoas, the glutes, the hamstrings and the calf so far, often muscles are asked to be tight because they're either trying to support or protect something, or the area that supplies that muscle, i.e. the spine, is prompting that musculature to be tight without you realizing. And in terms of chest muscle tightness, we're absolutely going to go through a couple of stretches at the end of the video that target chest muscle mobility. But when we're trying to have a conversation about why a chest muscle becomes tight in the first place, we can't answer that question unless we start talking about the function of your upper back and rib cage. So anatomically, the first thing that we need to understand if we're trying to understand why a chest muscle has become tight and what you need to improve to stop it from getting tight in the future is the anatomy of the chest musculature in terms of where they attach to and what influences those areas. As you may know, there are two muscles that we identify as your classical chest or pec muscles. We have your pectoralis minor and your pectoralis major. Your pec minor attaches from this little bump at the front of your shoulder onto your rib cage. Your pec major attaches from your arm into a large amount of surface area in your sternum and rib cage at the front. And what's really important to understand here is because both of these muscles anchor onto your rib cage, any dysfunction associated with your rib cage can ask those muscles to be tight to help out. And clinically as a physiotherapist, the interesting thing about chest muscle tightness is it's not so much dysfunction of the ribs at the front or of the rib joints as they attach into your sternum at the front. Classically, the reason why a lot of chest muscles become tight is because if you follow those ribs around to the back, we start to accrue some facet joint and rib joint dysfunction at the back. If those joints become stiff, tight, overloaded, if the musculature at the back becomes stiff, tight and overloaded, then anywhere along the course of those ribs can also become dysfunctional and prompt other soft tissues to help out at the same time. So for me as a physio, it's unrealistic to expect chest muscle stretching to permanently loosen tight chest muscles if you aren't also doing things to address the stiffness and the dysfunction of the rib joints and the spinal joints at the back. So what you can do is if you have a ball, again, classic lacrosse ball, tennis ball, doesn't matter what you have, we can take that ball and go hunting through some dysfunction in the upper back, try and get that dysfunction to settle, and then see what effect that has on your chest muscle tightness. So how this looks is if you can take your ball, we can start right at the top, right in the middle. If you let the ball come off to the side a fraction, you'll be on the facet joints, the spinal joints. If you come out a fraction wider again, you'll be on the rib joints as they attach into that spine. So if you can choose a spot, it doesn't matter where you start really, lie down on top of that ball. Again, start close up to the spine at any segment that you feel you want to start at. And then as always, what we want to get you to do is just move the ball around looking for something that feels stiff, tight, thick, hard, or dense. It may also be tender, but it may not be, especially if you don't have any pre-existing obvious pain in your upper back. So once you've found a spot that you would consider the stiffest and the tightest, you can just spend some time here allowing the ball to press in. If you need a little bit more pressure, you're welcome to bridge up a little bit more. But if that's a little bit too intense, what we can do instead is you can have your arm up. I can gently get you to lift your arm up and over as far as you feel comfortable, using shoulder movement to shear free some of the stiffness in your upper back. Keep moving the ball up or down and just keep repeating that process until you find that you've captured and hopefully mobilized any of those restricted segments. If I come out a little bit wider onto the rib itself, for me this feels a little bit stiffer than the spinal joints do. When I get my arm here, this is as far as I feel comfortable going. What you'll hopefully see is by gently exploring and oscillating in and out of that end range in a very short amount of time, trying to keep my arm straight, not just bending it so I can cheat. But in a short amount of time, it should start to go further and further and further, which ultimately means that I've loosened up that tissue more than what it was before. And if you can systematically work your way down each segment of your upper back, making sure that you start at the base of your neck, work your way down, and then come out to the side to hit the ribs and come all the way down there as well. As you shear free more and more of that movement and then come back to your chest muscle stretch again, you should instantly feel like there's more flexibility through the tissue tissue than what you had before. And if you can structure it like that in that order before we do any chest muscle stretching, you'll hopefully get a really strong understanding that some restriction around the back could be the catalyst for that tightness around the front. You shouldn't have to trust me. We just want to base all of this on results. And what's potentially even more important here is if you know that you can find one or two spots in your spine or your rib cage that feels particularly stiffer, tighter, and more restricted than the other side, and potentially areas above or below, then there has to be a reason why that is there as well. And again, as I've been going through with this video series, it's not enough just to free up the cause of your muscle tightness. We also need to try and understand why the cause of that muscle tightness is also there as well. And if you hang around to the end of the video, I'll give you a few clues as to where that might be coming from for you. So once you spend some time trying to mobilize any stiffnesses or restrictions you found in that rib cage, it's obviously really important to then go after that chest muscle tightness on its own. And while we always want to be very agnostic about which exercises work best for each person, there's a certain technique that you can apply to any chest muscle stretch that you may do that should hopefully make it instantly more effective than what it might otherwise be. So for the purposes of this video, I find that just your standard chest muscle stretch, where you have your forearm and your elbow up against the wall, can be a really great way to find and release some of that tight chest musculature. But what you want to do with this is you want to make sure you find the best version of this stretch for you. So in order to do that, you can start with your arm and your elbow at about 90 degrees. But what you'll notice is that if you take your arm up a little bit higher or a little bit lower, you might actually start to hit different parts of your chest than what you did if you just kept it at the same position each time. But ultimately what I want you to do is if you start at about 90 degrees and just gently try and turn your trunk away, looking for that classical chest muscle tightness. Now you might need to lean forward a little bit or lean back a little bit just to angle that towards the area that you feel you need it the most. But the important part is that once you've found that tightness, just hanging out in this position alone isn't essentially good enough. What we want to do instead is that once you've found the exact tightness that you're looking for, we need to tense that muscular tightness as best as we can for 5 to 10 seconds. You might find that when you relax, it'll give a little bit, and then you should be able to go a little bit further into the stretch than what you could ultimately do before. Then you'll very quickly find a way to loosen off that chest muscle faster and more effectively than just holding that position for 30 seconds or a minute. And then once you've done that, try this next technique as well to see if there's anything left over again. So after loosening up your upper back and stretching those tight chest muscles, the last thing you can do is take a ball or a roller of some sort and go looking for any other tissue restrictions that might be making you feel like your chest muscles are tighter than they need to be. What we can do is we can take that ball and place the ball anywhere in that chest area and lean up against a wall, moving the ball around, looking for anything that feels tight and tender for you. Once you've found a good spot, we can start to take your arm backwards, trying to shear free some of that tissue restriction, ultimately feeding more slack into the area. Now for me, it feels quite tight just here, but much like we did with the shoulder when we're trying to improve your upper back mobility, the more you can sort of do this, the further and further and further that hand and that arm should go as that tissue starts to release and free up. And then just keep hunting around anywhere that you need to, looking for anything that feels tight and restricted. What you can also do is once you've spent some time working into shoulder extension and opening up that tissue, we can also go into shoulder flexion and see if there's anything else at the top of this range that's also going to pull that open from the top. So again, coming up as high as you can, coming up all the way down the bottom. Essentially, that tissue isn't normal until you can express full range of motion in all directions, especially out to the side as well. Anything that might tension up that area needs to feel nice and loose. Otherwise, it's going to be impacting your shoulder function, your chest wall function, your neck function on top of that. So spending 5 minutes just hunting around through that chest muscle area and then incorporating movements to shear that tissue free can be a fantastic addition to the skills and the techniques that we've already started to talk about. But as I referenced earlier, in a lot of ways, each of these techniques is only going to be a symptomatic treatment, meaning you're going to potentially have to keep doing this again at some stage, unless we can take the biggest step back and try and understand why that upper back has become stiff and tight and potentially prompts the chest musculature to become tight as well. So once you spend some time finding and freeing up any of those restricted spots in your upper back that might be prompting those pec muscles to be tight in the first place, and you've found a version of a chest muscle stretch that works for you, we want to come back to that conversation that I alluded to earlier about why is all of this ultimately there in the first place. If a chest is tight and we're thinking that the reason why it's tight is the corresponding part of that chest wall at the back is become stiff, tight, and restricted, then there has to be a reason why that exact part of your spine that you released, or that part of your rib cage that you released, has been prompted to be stiff, tight, and restricted as well. And for me, clinically as a physiotherapist, the best way to understand this is to take a mental note of the positions and the shapes that you get into the most throughout the day, especially ones that may ask you to drop and roll forwards, because the weight of that arm in a rounded shape essentially hangs off of all that tissue that you might find has become stiff, tight, and restricted. And where the load goes over time, your brain recognizes that load and starts to reinforce against that load to support the shapes that you might unknowingly be getting into. So while it's easy for us to consider the active movements and the active things that we do because they stand out, in today's modern world, often it's the more relaxed, stationary shapes that we tend to spend the most time in throughout the day. It's really important to take note of the positions you might be in when you're on the couch watching TV, if you use a laptop, a computer, time spent on your iPhone, if you're someone who doesn't do any of that sort of stuff, but you love to sit and read or do arts and crafts. The shapes and the positions that you put your shoulder, upper back, and neck into can determine where the load goes over a long period of time. So if you found that one side of your spine or rib cage is stiffer than the other, then you would logically expect that there might be some asymmetrical position that you might be getting into without necessarily realizing it up until now. And it's really important that if you do care about getting rid of that chest muscle tightness forever, whether it's because you have chest pain, whether you have a shoulder that's not functioning as well as it could, and you care about shoulder performance, then again, it's unfortunately potentially unrealistic for you to expect that that chest muscle tightness will permanently go away if we're not then trying to get you back into a better position to express that tissue more normally and more functionally correct. All I would ask you to do is that if the tendency that you might find you get into is to drop and roll through those shoulders, then we're not necessarily trying to get you to take your shoulders back and down, which a lot of people tend to promote. What we're actually trying to do is the reverse of what you might find the position is that you're getting into the most throughout the day, which is instead of dropping and rolling forwards, we want to make sure that you take those shoulders back and then comfortably take them up a fraction. I like to tell my patients that I want you to take the weight of your shoulders. Don't feel like you're resting on them. And if you can start to remodel the basic shapes that you're in day to day, you'll change the way that you load up those tissues and hopefully short-circuiting that chain reaction of events that might be asking those pecs to be tight. So once again, I genuinely hope that was helpful and insightful. If it was, please let me know in the comments down below if that's something that you were or were not aware of. Please consider leaving a like on the video if you found it helpful. Subscribe to the channel if you like this type of content. If you've been dealing with an ache, pain, or an issue that you just can't seem to resolve and you would like my help, please consider booking in an online consultation with me. I'll leave a link in the description below. But as always, I genuinely appreciate you watching this and I hope to see you in the next one.